Hello and welcome to the Any Grief Goes podcast. And today I have Mo with me. Hi, Mo.
Hi, Brianne.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
Of course. I'm Mo, or Morag, my full name. All my friends and family call me Mo. I am a New Zealander, but I haven't lived in New Zealand for about 17 years. I currently live in France, and that is a consequence of losing my husband. We were travelling at the time and just house sitting our way around the world. And we ended up in a little village in the southwest of France, and property's really cheap here. And, in his infinite wisdom, he said, why don't we buy a little house here and we use it as a base and we'll explore Europe, something he'd always wanted to do. So we did. We bought a house, and 6 months after that, the pandemic started to kick in, and he wasn't very well. But he'd always had digestive issues throughout our whole married life. So I wasn't too worried, but it just went on for too long, and he was losing weight, and eventually he wouldn't go to the doctor because we were in the process of applying for residency. So we were in no man's land when it came to health insurance and what have you. But eventually he just, couldn't take it any longer. So went to the doctor, and he was diagnosed with stage 4 colorectal cancer. So that came as a huge shock, as you can imagine, especially with the pandemic kicking in, and he was already unwell. He dropped 40 kilos in weight already. So the battle to survive was real. Yeah, so it was pretty intense. And I think it took 18 months, and I think we didn't fully because of the language difficulties here, because our French was poor, and we hadn't actually planned on living here. Everything just all crashed in on us. So I don't think we fully understood the ramifications, the full diagnosis. I think I probably did, but he always had hope on his shoulder and was certain that he was going to at least get a remission. He knew that it would probably take him in the end, but he was looking for, a remission. That never came. Yeah, so it never came. So that 18 months was fairly intense, with treatments that none of them worked. Not one single one gave him any kind of improvement, and he just basically wasted away to a shadow.
Sorry, that's difficult.
Yeah, it was. He'd been a very successful international architect in the UAE. We lived in the UAE for 11 years. And I wonder whether the workload, because that was 60 to 80-hour weeks, and the expectations are high, and there's a lot of traveling, doing international projects and dealing with, different cultures. And it makes you wonder now, because obviously I've engaged in a lot of research since then, and I now understand the impact of stress on certain cancers and that type of thing. So it was a shock. It was a real shock because of how big and strong he was, and I wasn't prepared for it, obviously. But I don't think anyone's ever prepared, are they?
No.
No one's prepared for that kind of loss. I've learned since that we are a grief illiterate society, and people just, unless you actually go through something like grief at this level, you can never fully understand exactly how it feels and how it changes you and changes your life.
Yeah. I want to talk about how it changes, but first of all, I wonder if it's okay to ask if you would talk about the 18 months, because we speak a lot about anticipatory anxiety and what that feels like. And you touched on the fact that you perhaps had a more dim outlook than he did. And how did that last 18 months play out with conversations and preparation, and what support did you have being in a totally alien environment to you?
That's a good question. The French health system is very robust. It's very good, in actual fact. So that we had an appointment with an oncologist about 6 weeks after diagnosis, and she gave us a treatment program of, he had tumours in his colon which had metastasized to his liver. So the treatment program was chemotherapy to shrink the tumours enough so that they could operate. So they were going to remove the tumours from both the colon and the liver, and then there'd be kind of clean up chemotherapy, so to speak. And that sounded very positive to me at that point. So we started that about very soon after that. But because he had lost so much weight and he was already in a very poor health condition, he struggled with the side effects of the chemotherapy, and they had to and at that very beginning, I was able to drive him. The hospital was 50 kilometres away, and I was able to drive him there. But once the pandemic kicked in, I was no longer able to go into the hospital, so he had to go by himself at that stage. But they took one of the components of the chemo out to help reduce the side effects. But I think that taking that out reduced the efficacy of the chemo. So when he got to the end of the 3 months, it had made no difference at all. And in fact, the tumours in his liver had grown. So by this stage, as I said, the health systems here is very robust, and they have what they call ambulance taxis. So he was picked up and driven to chemo every day by the same person who we got to know. And even though my French was poor, I was able to communicate with him. He was very good. And he'd wait for Brian, and he'd text me how he was on the way home and that kind of thing. So that was very, very helpful. Then they decided to operate on his bowel, even though the tumour hadn't shrunk. So they removed the tumour from his bowel and fitted him with a colostomy bag. So he had a colostomy bag on the outside of his body, and then they did radiation, and that was just horrendous. He was so ill. All this time, I felt like I was like this the whole time. You know, I was so stressed by the whole thing, couldn't be with him, and I was able to go to the follow-up appointments with the oncologist, luckily, and she kept talking of palliative care, and I understood what palliative care was, especially in his circumstances. But he wouldn't. We never talked about it. We never ever talked about the possibility that he would never go into remission, that he would die during this process, and I respected that in him, because that was all he had at that stage, was hope. So I never pushed him to bring it up. So I don't know how I dealt with it. I don't think I dealt with it terribly well. I had 3 falls during that 18 months, and one fall I broke my wrist. So I think I was just in such a state, I was doing silly things, like tripping and what have you. And so I spent 12 weeks with a cast on my right wrist, which made life a lot more difficult. And then eventually they put him into a clinical trial, because they'd sort of come to the end of the road as far as treatments went, because the tumours just kept growing and his condition kept deteriorating. So the last hope was this clinical trial. It was like a lotto. there was 2 different treatments, and I'm not 100% sure whether one was just a placebo, and I honestly don't know, because the documentation was like this, and I tried to translate it, and just all too very hard. But whatever he got just didn't, once again, had no effect on him. It was supposed to give you a better quality of life. So he said, well, you know, if we get I get a bit of quality of life, then maybe we can do a little bit traveling. And I know that it's not going to cure me, but, you know, but of course that was just a pipe dream. So eventually we just got to the point where one Friday afternoon he said to me, "This isn't working, is it?" And I said, "No." And he just broke down.
Take your time, please.
So he had an appointment with the oncologist on the following Monday. Sorry, it's quite emotional to talk about.
It is, and if you want to stop, you can. If you want to continue, you can. Whatever's best for you.
So we basically went to bed for the weekend. We closed the shutters, and we just, you know, just to be together. And then on the Monday morning, he just couldn't get out of bed to go to the oncology appointment. So I called the hospital, and they sent an ambulance, like a proper ambulance, not a taxi, and they took him away to hospice. And on the following day, the Tuesday, I drove up there, and he was just lying in a bed, asleep or unconscious, I'm not 100% sure. And the oncologist arrived, and with 2 nurses and the 2 oncology nurses, and we just all stood around his bed, and the oncologist said to me, "We need his permission to discontinue treatment if that's what you want to do, because you know what this means, don't you?" And I said yes. So they woke him and said, "You want to discontinue treatment?" And he nodded. And the oncologist said, "You understand what this means?" And he nodded. And that was it. He died a week later.
It's I can't imagine the loss of a spouse, and all I can think, it must be incredibly distressing and just so hard. Did you have, what support did you have in that area? Were you able to build up a support network?
Yeah, luckily, it's a small village. Well, there's only 1,400 people in this village, and there's a big expat community, mostly British. And I'd made friends really quickly, because I was a walker. Like, I used to walk, 20,000 steps a day. It was something that I always did. And I quickly developed a walking group here, and very, very close friends. And they were just there for me, And during COVID was difficult because we were all in little bubbles. So, and I couldn't risk him him being infected by anything, because his immune system was compromised, obviously. So that was quite isolating. But after he died, I sort of slept in a chair by his bed for most of the week, and then one night I had an apartment in a building next door to the hospice where I could go and shower and eat and stuff, but I didn't sleep there until the last night, and I was just exhausted. So I went and had a glass of wine and a sleeping pill, and slept, and woke up at 6 o'clock in the morning to 6 missed calls from the hospice, and he died at 1 o'clock in the morning alone. So I immediately called 2 couples here that I was very close to, and they drove straight to me. And one of the wives just took over, and she did everything. She arranged, because in France you have to have the funeral within 7 days of a death. There's no time to think about anything. And so we weren't allowed to we're only allowed 6 people, I think it was. And both my children were, one of my sons lives in London and one lives in Melbourne, so they weren't able to travel. But everything was arranged, everything was done for me. But then I went home from the hospice to one of those couples, so I stayed with them. And it was 4 days before Christmas, the 21st of December. So I spent a week with them, spent Christmas with them. I don't know what I would have done if I had to come home on my own to my own home, sort of thing. But the day of the funeral, I just, walking into that funeral home and seeing his coffin and the PowerPoint presentation, and I just broke down, just collapsed on the floor. Because as you say, losing a spouse after, being together for so long is just indescribable.
Tell me about your grieving process then, if you can. I know that obviously grief doesn't end. There's always going to be pain. But in the last, however long, you have got yourself to a point, you've gone through a widow's program, you've got yourself to a point where you are feeling more positive and feeling like you've got more purpose. So tell me about that grieving process and how did you get to the point that you're at now after such pain and devastation?
I went to London to be with my son and daughter-in-law as soon as the borders opened and I was able to travel and that kind of thing. And, so I spent 3 months there, and in the early days we just grieved together, it was like but I was still feeling like grief is visceral, like the pain of grief is visceral. It's actual physical pain. And I was struggling with that, like I had the emotional and mental pain of my loss, but the physical pain, I didn't know how. I wanted someone to give me a pill, just give me a pill, make me better. What's the panacea for grief? And I had no idea. So I used to just hide away in my room sometimes when I just I didn't want to talk to anybody, didn't want to be with anybody. And I started looking for something. And I came across a podcast on Spotify, a lady in the UK who is Britain's first, or the UK's first widow grief coach. And she had a podcast, and I don't know, something like 48 podcasts or something. And I just started listening to her from the first one. She was actually a widow herself. And everything she said just resonated with me. She was just validating my feelings. And it gave me hope, it gave me hope. She was maybe 5 or 6 years into her grief journey, and she'd recreated herself because she was a midwife, I think, when her husband died, and she had a Facebook page, so I joined that. It was called Widowed and Rising, and then she also had a membership called Remember, and it was a subscription, a monthly subscription, but she would, I think it was 3 times a month, she would do a Zoom, and it would be on a specific topic to do with grief. And it would be, I think an hour and a half long, and we would all be on a Zoom. So it'd be a group Zoom, and sometimes there could be 40 people on there, and we were able to have input. and she would put us into breakout rooms where there'd be only 3 or 4 of us, and we'd all talk it through. And that helped me enormously because it made me realize that I wasn't alone. Because I thought I'm the only person in the world feeling this way, because I'd never known anybody who'd lost their husband before. And it just, it made me feel hopeful that I could find a way to heal myself. And I realized too that you can't heal in isolation. You have to find your peers. You have to find people who are going through what you're going through, because they know what you're feeling. They know exactly what you're feeling. And sometimes you feel parts of the grief process are quite confronting, and you think, is this normal? And then somebody else on that Zoom would be talking about that happening to them, and I think, oh my God, I'm not going mad. So I subscribed to that for 18 months, I guess, because I'm 2 years and 9 months now. And then this lady had another program, a 12-month program that you mentioned before, which was called Finding Hope in Widowhood. And it was at the 18-month point, I think, when I sort of went through that acceptance stage of grief, accepting that he was gone and I had to make a life for myself. And I needed to find myself, and I needed to kind of not leave the grief behind, but I needed to augment the grief process into more of a self-development program, if you like. Does that make sense? And I thought that's what that would give me. Alongside the grieving, I would be developing myself and finding my way. And so I embarked on that. I've just finished last week, actually. So it was 12 months of weekly sessions and learning modules, and it's just helped me enormously. I connected with a group of women, and we've got a separate little Zoom that we do on a Sunday night, every Sunday night. And now we don't even talk about our grief. We just talk about life, and, we laugh, and if we need each other, because sometimes things happen and the grief comes back in a wave, we're there for each other, and we'll reach out, and, we know that we've always got that support network of those peers who'll always be there. So that's how I dealt with my grief. And because I knew really early on that I didn't want my grief to define me and the rest of my life, because I'd seen other widows on social network who were on social media, I should say, who were 9, 10, 11 years down the track and still crying in a corner. And I didn't want that. I didn't want it for me. I didn't want it for my children either, because, and Brian, I knew Brian wouldn't want that for me either. So I knew I had to find a way to heal and make a life, and that's what I've done. It's been really, really tough, really tough. But I feel now, even though I'm emotional today, that's normal. And I've never hidden my feelings. Like, I've never felt embarrassed to cry and show my emotions, because every time you do, you heal a little bit more. So you release the pain, because if you don't allow it to come out, it just builds up inside and it just poisons you, basically. So, I've never been shy about showing my grief, and I've always tried to encourage other people to do it as well.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, because it is really important. Grief does need to be expressed, and there's no shame for anybody out there listening to express your grief in however it chooses to express itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I have so much compassion for anyone going through grief. I really do. And I just want to share what I've learned as well, going forward. I want to share that wealth of experience that I have.
So let's talk about life changes then, because so far you've touched on kind of two different types of change. There's obviously the change that your husband has sadly passed away, and now your life has changed in terms of routines and how you live and practicalities. But then you also talk about a change where you decided that actually mentally, personally, developmentally, that needed to change alongside it. So can you speak about one of those things, both of those things, whatever resonates with you about that?
Yeah. I think in our relationship, it was pretty traditional, I guess, for our age, like for our time. And Brian always took the main role as the role as the main provider, and he was he always made the big decisions, and always in consultation with me. I'm not saying that he ruled the roost, so to speak, but I always felt in awe of him. He was such a clever man. When he first died, or I knew he was going to die, I thought, how will I ever live a life without him? Because he's always driven our lives, driven everything we did. But since he died, I realized that I have the ideas, I have the intelligence, I have the capacity now. I mean, you have to develop the capacity over time, because the exhaustion from grief is just next level. So it's very slow, but I have learned that I am so strong and so resilient and so smart. I never thought I was a very smart person, but I am. I've taught myself so many new things since he died. I'm developing a business of my own. And I'm proud of that, but I'm also conscious that a lot of that comes from him. So in that way, I'm honoring him, and it's like a legacy, because he was so smart, and I learned so much from him, and I've been able to put what I've learned from him into practice for myself. As far as general life goes, it's lonely. There's no getting around that fact that even though I have a lot of really close friends around me, I still go to bed alone, wake up alone. The silence in the house is deafening sometimes, but I also, I've rationalized that on numerous occasions by, saying to myself, there's lots of women that choose to be single all their lives, choose not to have families, and they have, full, rich, happy lives. So there's no reason why I can't do that myself. So I work on that constantly. I work on my loneliness constantly by finding ways to fill those moments, to the point now where I like my alone time. I enjoy friends, and I enjoy doing things, but I treasure my alone time now. And I think that's part of the process of development, self-development that I've gone through. I think also one of the hard parts of losing your spouse is, you lose your income for a start, because he was the primary income earner. You lose your future, or the future that you had in your mind, because you had planned your future together. And you lose your dreams, all those things that you dreamed of doing together are gone. But I have new dreams now. I didn't initially, Like I struggled to find a purpose in life. I struggled to get out of bed on a lot of days. I wanted to go with him. Never attempted anything. I'm not saying I did. I went through a period of depression and all those sorts of things, but I have a purpose now. And I have a reason to get up in the morning, and I make a plan. And, you know, I still have what I call grief waves. I still have days where I just can't do life. And if I can't do life, then I don't. And I reach out to whomever I was supposed to be doing something with that day, and I said, I can't do life today. I'll see you when I can. And I'll quite often just spend the day in bed, close the shutters and rest. Rest is critical in this journey.
Rest is critical, and as is listening to your body on days like that and doing what you
Absolutely.
need.
Absolutely.
Tell us a bit then about your purpose, what it is that's driving you forward, and then how did you know that that was what your purpose was now?
Well, my purpose now is to share my, not exactly my experience, but share what I've learned from my experience. Because when Brian first died, I didn't know what I was looking for to help me through the journey, but I've now identified resources that I wish I had known were available, and I've created my own. So, you know, I've written for one book, which is a guide to self-care. I've got them here, and I might just give you a flash.
Yeah, do.
I've written a navigating grief, a guide to self-care, because self-care, it sounds like a sort of little catchphrase, but it's not. It's a very deep and meaningful part of the grieving process. And what it means something different to every person. And in those early days, self-care can be as small as getting out of bed, having a shower, eating something, you know, sitting in the garden, tiny little things. And as time goes on, self-care becomes bigger things. You know, for me now at this stage, I'm focused on trying to get back to the level of walking I was doing before. And I tried I'm not very good at mindfulness. My mind goes everywhere, but, you know, meditation, walking, knitting, you know, being creative, they all help. I just found out that I'm going to become a grandmother in January, first time. And I've always been a knitter, but I lost my mojo. You know, what's the point, you know? But I've started knitting it, all of those things. So I wrote this little, it's not big, it's only 53 pages, but it explains self-care and gives guidance on how to take care of yourself during your grief journey. And the other thing I found really helpful when I started quite early on was journaling, because getting it, sometimes it's very hard to articulate what you're feeling, and you don't often have someone that you can do that with because you're on your own now. So I started journaling. So I've written a guided grief journal called Healing Reflections. So in it are prompts, because often you'll sit down to journal and your mind goes blank. You know, you're just so engrossed in your own self-pity some days. So I've followed the 5 stages of grief, and I know there's a lot of talk about 5 stages of grief being irrelevant now, but I personally feel it's a good guide to follow. So I've followed that with my Healing Reflections guided prompt journal to help people learn to journal, because often journaling's not easy. And I found in my group, my widows group, a lot of people just couldn't do it. They just could not get the hang of it. And it was like, so what do we journal about? What do we say? What do we write about? And it just stuck in my mind. And I thought, I can take everything that I've learned and all of those little, conversations I've had with other widows and try and bring it all together in some kind of resource that might be helpful to the widow community, or the widows and surviving partners. I'm not excluding, widowers or, life partners or whatever. So that's where I found the purpose, and it gave me, I got really excited because I could utilize a lot of the software programs and technology that Brian had bought and never used because he became ill soon after. So I've kind of followed the model of his business, which was similar, but he was focused in his industry. And I've kind of, it's amazing how much I've learned from just, being beside him throughout the development of that. And then the other thing that is a great healer in this journey is gratitude. But the gratitude doesn't come easily, and it comes very, very late. And because I'm 2 years and 9 months, so nearly 3 years, and I'm only now beginning to find gratitude in life and certain things. So I've done the same thing. I've written a gratitude through grief, a guided healing journal for widows, widowers, and surviving partners. So same thing, prompts, affirmations, mantras, inspirational quotes, just to support. I just don't want his death to have been for nothing, I guess.
And
You know what I mean?
no, I know exactly what you mean. There's something so meaningful in being able to honor somebody and celebrate somebody, and a way of keeping them with you. So, they're not forgotten. You don't want them to be forgotten.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think, people now, no one's actually ever said to me, aren't you over your grief yet? But, you get that feeling from certain people. But, and even me, I keep thinking, I'm nearly 3 years, I should be feeling better. And most days I do feel okay, but some days I feel so unwell and discombobulated. I think, why am I feeling this way when I'm 3 years into it? But, the reality is that it'll never go away. It'll be, with me forever. But, my healing is my responsibility. No one can help me. No, people can help me. No one can fix me.
And
You know what I mean?
no one can
No,
fix you or do it for you.
no, that's right.
Mm.
I have to do it for myself. So I've been working so hard on it, and I actually realized just recently that, I've had a lot of grief in my life, but never really dealt with it or visited it as meaningfully as I have with losing my husband. And that's impacted me. So in 2011, there was an earthquake in Christchurch in New Zealand, where I come from, and my sister was killed. There was 187 people killed in that earthquake, and my sister was one of them. She was lost for 10 days, and, she was under the rubble of one of the collapsed buildings. And at the time, I can remember, like, I went home, obviously, I was in the UAE. I went home for 3 months, but I don't think I ever really dealt with that loss. So I've now written a guided healing journey for grieving siblings, because in my sister's memory, because I realise now that, that grief, when you don't deal with grief, there's so much grief and trauma throughout a life. And if you don't actually deal with it, when something of this magnitude happens, it all starts to come back. So you have to kind of almost, and my mum died and my dad died, and, you know, all of those losses, you tend to just, and I lost 2 babies at quite late gestation, but I was so intent on getting pregnant again and having another baby that I never actually dealt with any of those things to the level that I should have. So I think maybe, you know, that has exacerbated this grief process. So I just want to share. I want to share with people so that, you know, at some point, maybe we'll be less illiterate as a society.
That is a beautiful goal, and one that I really hope does happen. Where
I
can
hope so.
people access your resources?
Well, I have a website, which I've been, you know, that's the other thing I've done since is build a website, because Brian built a website for our other business, but I've done this myself. I have a website. All of my books are available through Amazon, and I've just gone over the 1,000 followers on TikTok, so I can now post the link to my website on my TikTok profile. So yes, that's where they're available on it. They're all available on Amazon. And if anyone does want to purchase one, I'd love it if just leave me a review, because the more people that we can reach, the more impactful my healing journey can be on the grief community. You know, the more people I can reach to, you know, make someone else's journey a little easier, or maybe not easier, but support
Yeah,
another person's journey.
and I think it's really important. I think people who are so happy to talk about their experiences and who have provided such great resources, this is so important, because we know, as you said earlier, that we don't heal as well on our own. We really do need to access support from others. We do really need a community that we can tap into. So being able to have somebody like you that does this and shares resources for people is really, really wonderful. And if anybody out there is grieving, please do tap into what support you can.
Yes, definitely. Just and it's different for everyone. You know, some people may not find it easy to share. You know, and also some people aren't technologically able. But you know, I had to find that online support because living in rural France is nothing here. So I had to go elsewhere. But you living, you know, in a city, say for example, you've probably got a grief group at your church or anywhere. And the availability of resources is much greater. It just depends what type of support you're looking for.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to wrap up, but I wondered if you could just give some final thoughts to people. Like, what would you want others to know about grief and how to cope with it?
Grief is a lifelong companion, but it doesn't have to destroy your life. It doesn't have to destroy you or your life. It's, gosh, that's such a big question. It's a process, but it has to be a gentle process. So don't ever try to force yourself to move along. Just listen to your body, listen to your heart, listen to your mind, and just allow whatever comes to happen. I've recognized that now, that the grief comes in waves, and if you avoid that wave, is just going to take longer because there's no avoiding it. So lean into your grief, I would say. That would be my biggest take, is lean into your grief and take every opportunity that you can to talk about your person. Even though often people don't want to hear. I went on a walk yesterday, a 5-kilometre kind of, organised walking group walk. And it was the weirdest thing, but I started talking to this French lady, and luckily she spoke English as well. And it turned out that her husband had died 2 years ago. And I don't often bring it up in strange or new situations anymore. I'm kind of past that. In the early days, you want everybody to know, you're in a cafe, my husband died, type of thing, because it's just so raw. But she started talking and she started crying, and she said, I feel so alone. I have no one to talk to about this that really understands what I'm going through. And she stopped in the middle of this trail and gave me a big hug and said, thank you so much for listening. Because I said to her, what was your husband's name? And, and what did he die of? And it was it could be seen as being very intrusive, but she just gave me the biggest hug and said, thank you so much. She said, no one asks me anymore. She said, so I feel like my husband's lost. And I just thought, I felt so good.
Yeah, and I think that's not just great advice for somebody that's grieving. This is perfect advice for anybody out there who wants to know how to help someone that's grieving.
Yeah.
Talking about the person is not going to upset them any more than they're already upset. It's going to bring them some joy, and
Absolutely.
do that. Anybody out there?
Yeah, absolutely. Take the opportunity as often as you can to talk about your person.
Can you just leave us then, if you can, with one of your favourite memories of Brian?
It's funny you should say that, because I told you I was doing writing this morning. My husband was an arrogant a-hole. He honestly was. He was so full of himself, and he had every right to be. He was an architect and an environmental scientist, and he had an opinion on everything, world politics, and he posted on social media all the time, and anyone challenged him and he was right in there. And he used to make me wild, he used to really annoy me. But now when I think about it, it makes me laugh. And I love the fact that he didn't give a toss what people thought of him. He had an opinion and he was entitled to his opinion, and you're entitled to yours. And, I wish I could see another post on Facebook or Twitter from him.
Mm-hmm.
He had the biggest personality. He was very outgoing, very gregarious, very tall, very handsome, just an amazing man. But he was a pain in the, what sometimes. And I think that's the other thing. Oh, we got time. That was the other thing. When your person first dies, you've got them on this pedestal, and they were so perfect. They never, never did anything wrong. And, but as time goes on and you work your way through your grief, all of these things come back to you and you think, he wasn't actually that perfect, He used to annoy the heck out of me with those posts on Facebook, and he even fell out with a couple of my girlfriends who were quite opinionated as well, because he would not listen to other people's opinions on things, or he would listen but he would challenge. So yeah, that was a funny thing about him. He was very full of himself, but it was warranted in my opinion.
Oh, well, thank you so much for sharing your experience. I really appreciate you coming on as a guest.
Thank you, Brianne. I'm really pleased I met you. I love watching your videos on TikTok. They're so inspiring and educational too, helpful. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
For having me.
Thanks very much.
Okay.